great to be here at the conference as a consumer, and I love that consumer voices are honored. My presentation is entitled BPD, Parental Self-Harm and Child Protection, Confronting Stigma While Ensuring Safety. And a little bit about me. As Megan said, I'm the author of Etched on Me, a novel that came out from Simon & Schuster in February of this year. I'm a mental health consumer. I'm a recovered self-harmer. I'm a proud graduate of a DBT program, and I'm the parent of a young child. And Etched on Me is, to the best of my knowledge, the first published fictional account of recovery through dialectical behavior therapy. And it's inspired by the story of a young woman in the UK named Fran, Lyon, who will be my case study for this presentation. And our learning objectives today are increased awareness regarding stigma and controversies in child protection of parents who have BPD, and increased knowledge of tailored models for parent support. So I'll present the case study of Fran, Lyon, discuss some child welfare concerns that have been pinpointed for parents with BPD, run through some intervention options, and make some recommendations that are informed by my personal experience as a consumer. So this young woman is Fran, Lyon. When her story entered the media in the UK in 2007, she was 22 years old. She had a significant history of trauma as a child, both physical and sexual abuse. She had a significant history of self-harm and was diagnosed with BPD, borderline personality disorder, in her teens. Now, borderline personality disorder is already a fairly controversial diagnosis in adults, but it's even more controversial in teens, mainly because a lot of the diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder, such as impulsive behavior and unstable or shifting identity, are really the developmental hallmarks of adolescence. So there's definitely some controversy as to whether or not young people under the age of 18 can be diagnosed. There is a physician practitioner named Blaise Aguirre, who does a fair amount of research at McLean and Hatton Hospital, and has an inpatient DBT unit for teens, and has written some books about adolescents with BPD. So there is a growing body of literature about BPD in teens, and Fran Lyon was given that diagnosis. And she was hospitalized for a year in a therapeutic residential community. And by the time Fran reached her 20s, she had graduated from university and was actually working in the nonprofit charity sector on the board of directors of two organizations devoted to personality disorder awareness. And she became pregnant at the age of 22 as a single parent, and came to the attention of UK Social Services, and she was very, very frank with them about her history, and submitted a declaration, a letter of recommendation of sorts, from her treating psychiatrist, who declared that she was recovered and that she did not pose a risk to her child. However, UK Social Services still had grave concerns and convened a child protection case conference. It's also important to note that this was her first child, and she had absolutely no criminal offending history. And Social Services' concerns in the Fran Lyon case were twofold. The first was that she fit the profile of an MSbP, Munchausen syndrome by proxy perpetrator. And the second was the potential for emotional abuse and neglect of her child. And their plan of action was immediate removal of her daughter at birth and placement into a foster placement. And so what was the outcome of this really dramatic case? There was major media attention in newspapers in the UK. That's how I found out about this story. There was a great deal of political outcry. Members of Parliament were taking up her case. She did lodge several appeals and hired a solicitor with a great deal of experience in child welfare proceedings, but all of those appeals failed. So she made the difficult decision to leave the UK for Sweden when she was about 7 months pregnant. She said in media interviews she literally took only what she could carry. And she did have contact with Swedish social services. They provided her with mentoring and a support package and determined that she was not a risk to her child, and she went on to deliver a healthy baby girl without incident. So looking at this really heartbreaking situation, there are some really significant concerns on both sides of the ledger in terms of a very difficult, delicate balance of parents' civil rights and the obligation and duty to protect at-risk children. And when I look at this case, two major questions come to mind. One, were social services concerns legitimate? And two, if so, could those concerns be addressed with targeted supports instead of loss of custody? And my research on both queries says yes. So what are the child welfare concerns that clinicians and social workers have regarding parents with BPD? There are a few of them. The Munchausen syndrome by proxy potential, and I'll discuss that, I know I keep mentioning it. Disturbed attachment patterns in both the child and the parent. The parentification and role reversal of the child, which has been discussed a lot in general psychiatric populations as well. And for those individuals with a BPD diagnosis who are survivors of sexual abuse, and estimates can range as high as 75% of individuals with the diagnosis, those individuals can potentially have problematic sequelae of that abuse in terms of complex PTSD that would affect their parenting. So this MSbP that I keep mentioning, informally known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. There's also a version of simply Munchausen syndrome in which the symptoms are self-inflicted. You can see the DSM-5 diagnosis. It was tweaked a little bit from DSM-4, and it's falsification of physical or psychological signs or symptoms or induction of injury or disease in another. The preferred term is factitious disorder imposed on another, and most of the time it's a parent, almost always a mother, either falsifying information leading to lead to a diagnosis, or actually in extreme cases tampering with test results, introducing foreign substances into IV lines, or even suffocation or smothering. There have been deaths related to this diagnosis. And where do MSbP and BPD intersect? There was a perpetrator profile based on convicted cases that Bowles et al. Put together. 55% of the women had a history of self-harm, and that's deliberate self-mutilation as opposed to medical harm. 36% of them had cluster B personality disorders, which would include BPD because BPD falls under cluster B and is the most common personality disorder. There was a 25% incidence of sexual abuse history in childhood, and there was a 75% incidence of somatoform disorders, which was an issue in the Fran Lyon case. She had been fitted with a tracheotomy, allegedly to deal with severe allergic reactions due to angioedema, and there was some speculation and concern as to whether some of that was fabricated or self-inflicted. So yes, very serious concerns with MSbP and mortality rates, but the diagnosis itself, like BPD, is not without controversy. The originator of the concept, Roy Meadow, was a physician in the UK who coined this term in the early 80s, and his often relayed quote is, one sudden infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder until proven otherwise. And there were actual multiple criminal convictions of women in the UK, and you can see a few names there, and they were actually sent to prison. Some of them lodged appeals using the same solicitor that Fran Lyon did, and all 3 of these women's convictions were overturned. The children were found to have a rare genetic disorders or incidents of traditional SIDS. And this gentleman was at one point stripped of his license to practice in the UK. So the origination of the term is fairly suspect, and there have been some pretty dramatic reversals. But still, there's some salient issues raised in the literature about MSbP that can have some real resonance for borderline personality disorder. So this researcher posits that MSbP is, quote, an attempt to avenge and repair past perceived or real humiliations of childhood, which really holds some resonance for individuals with BPD who have abandonment issues or childhood trauma. So even if you take MSbP and its controversy out of the picture, there are still some risk factors and concerns regarding parents with BPD. Children of mothers with BPD have a higher risk of psychiatric disturbances, which is in line with the statistics that we have on the general psychiatric population of parents. Infants and toddlers of mothers with BPD display disorganized attachment, which is the least common attachment style. It tends to incorporate frozen watchfulness and bizarre behavior. It's frequently seen in situations of childhood abuse and neglect, or situations in which there's been an adoption placement or long-term institutionalization. The mothers diagnosed with BPD also display attachment difficulties, specifically an unresolved style, due to, again, their own histories of childhood abandonment. And as I said earlier, for parents who are survivors of sexual abuse, the sequelae of PTSD can be very problematic. For women especially, the physical experiences of birth and breastfeeding can be very triggering. And also, if dissociation is present, it then makes a parent much less likely to be able to be present and grounded in their interactions with their children. So I like to keep the focus positive. There's a lot of gloom and doom and negative prognosticating with BPD, so I like to focus on positive options and the potential for recovery. So we have several options here. You can see there's a range, some of them individual, some of them group-based, some of them inpatient, some of them intensive outpatient. And it's important to note here that they can be used to prevent custody loss or to improve reunification prospects if a child is already in an out-of-home placement. And here are some of the individual therapy options. And none of them are parenting interventions per se, but they can be modified and used to address parenting issues. My personal favorite, huge fan, it absolutely saved my life without a doubt, of DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And DBT blends the mindfulness practice of Zen Buddhism with more traditional cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. It was devised by Dr. Marshall Linehan at the University of Washington and demonstrated effectiveness in several randomized controlled trials. It's considered the first-line treatment of choice for women who chronically self-harm or make suicide attempts. And it includes an individual therapy component and a group component in which clients are taught skills such as affect regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. These are all skills that can generalize to parenting improvement. The downside to DBT is that it's quite time-consuming. To cycle through the different modules, it generally takes about a year, and so that can be quite costly. A similar but shorter intervention is called STEPS, Systems Training for Emotional Predictability and Problem Solving. It's a briefer intervention, much shorter than DBT, and it is manualized, which makes it more efficient and easy for clinicians to use without the more in-depth training that's required in order to practice DBT with good fidelity. It does take place in skills groups similar to those in DBT, and an unusual distinctive element is that it offers psychoeducation for family members of the person with DBT, which is something that occasionally will be treated as an add-on or adjunct in DBT clinical practices. For instance, the program that I went to in Portland, Oregon occasionally offered a one-day workshop for family members, but it's not specifically embedded as part of the treatment the way that it is in STEPS. Oh my goodness, I believe I don't have that information here. And then next we have Schema therapy, which was developed by Jeffrey Young. And it is distinct in that it directly addresses the impact of the mother's own childhood experiences and offers a limited reparenting approach. I like to think of it as mothering the mother. And Jeffrey Young's concept of schemas, he delineates 16 different ones, quite a range, are early attachment-based negative concepts of self and other. And schema therapy identifies these schemas and encourages reflecting on and reframing of them. So it's kind of a blend of cognitive behavioral therapy and more psychodynamic approaches. And like DBT, it can be quite time-consuming. It actually tends to be more time-consuming than DBT because of the psychodynamic aspect and sometimes takes several years. And then we have mentalization-based therapy, which was developed by Peter Fonagy. He defines mentalization as the ability to reflect upon and understand one's own thoughts and feelings and those of others. And the piece of being able to mentalize others' thoughts is particularly germane to BPD. He feels that people with BPD lack this skill and therefore engage in mind reading and automatic negative assumption of others' thoughts. And skills training could potentially increase a parent's receptivity to their child if they have the ability to mentalize when, for instance, if their child is showing frustration, they're not going to jump to the assumption that the child is angry or doing it to personally, as a personal attack, but is actually just expressing a developmentally appropriate emotional need. And then there are some direct parent-child interventions, dyadic psychotherapy, which is very, very focused on the child. There's some controversy and criticism of that because it does incorporate therapeutic physical holding of the child. There's an intervention called Watch, Wait, and Wonder, in which there are half-hour sessions that are videotaped and observed by a therapist. And in those sessions, parent and child spend time together, and the focus is on the parent going with the flow, following the child's lead, not trying to influence or direct the session. And then after the session, the therapist and the client review the video together and discuss strengths and ways that they handle things positively and then areas for improvement. And then there's something called Circle of Security, which is frequently used in adoption situations where there's been attachment trauma and disruption. It's a psychoeducation component for parents that teaches them about attachment therapy, the impacts of attachment disruption, and ways to positively foster strong attachment. And it's important to note that study outcomes with parents with BPD have been mixed in these treatments, but these interventions have not been adapted specifically to this population, which would influence those outcomes. And peer support is another huge one. It's recognized as an evidence-based practice in the general psychiatric population. Guidance has been prepared for peer support of women who self-harm. There's a great guide by Beth Filson. It's listed in my references. It's a free download. And that would be a great potential model for adapting to parenting. There's also the pilot study of online support for mothers with mental illness that the Temple University Collaborative for Community Inclusion put together. I was actually a member of that study. And another idea that we've heard quite a bit about at the conference is peer support for children, which can mitigate that parentification effect. And then some more intensive options are therapeutic communities and intensive outpatient programs. Fran Lyon spent a year at the Castle Hospital in London and considered that instrumental to her recovery. There's also an outpatient day program in the UK called the Haven Project. It's a long-term day program for people with personality disorders, and it's very much tailored to their needs, which I think is crucial. People with BPD and people who are in self-harm recovery need very specific targeted interventions. And I can tell you as a consumer that spending time in day treatment options that were geared more toward general major mood disorders, psychoeducation, were not nearly as effective for me as treatment settings in which trauma and emotion regulation skills were discussed. The Haven provides specific parenting support programs, and another thing that they do that's critical for people with BPD is they provide step-down and transitional services from the full-day program. They found that as their clients were improving and moving into considering employment and volunteering, they were very, very apprehensive about having to leave the program and felt like they needed a safety net and an option for support so that they could they didn't have to be in a crisis to access support. So the transitional service was very important to them. Those two programs are both UK-based and publicly NHS funded. They're virtually unheard of in the US unless you're independently wealthy. And the closest international approximate would be the Spectrum BPD service in Australia. So this is a really cool quote from a Haven client. She says that she did another parenting course through social services. She says it was like a kindergarten one, don't pick your children up by the ears kind of thing. And she appreciates the Haven course because it's fuller and specifically targeted, and I think one of the important things that she says, it has also confirmed some of the good things we are doing. After you've been poked and prodded by social services, this course validates and gives confidence in what we are doing that is right. So a strengths-based approach. Another option are mother-baby units. They allow for observation of mother and child as a dyad. Some programs are designed for women with postnatal depression for observation and intervention in crisis. Some of them are actually designed for parents and older children so that they can be observed frequently. There'll be a 12-week assessment. It's not a forensic assessment, but it's done in situations where out-of-home placements are being considered. It may be particularly useful in cases of suspected MSbP because it allows for close observation in a medical setting. And interestingly enough, Fran Lyon offered this as a potential compromise in her case. You can actually look on YouTube and see the television interviews that she did, and she was very articulate. And she said, I understand social workers have really difficult calls to make. I'm more than willing to go into a unit and be observed 24/7 to prove that I'm not a risk to my child, but that request was denied. Barriers for these, again, they're costly stays, very lengthy. There are few spaces available in the UK and Europe, and again, none of them exist in the US. So we're talking about a lot of interventions, and but we need to remember some key principles, focusing on strengths, remembering that quote from the Haven client, and validation, which is crucial for people with BPD. One of the reasons that Marsha Linehan formulated DBT was because she found that her clients with BPD were not responding well to traditional cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. They found the focus on change invalidating given their great suffering. And she found that emphasizing the dialectic of doing the best you can while simultaneously needing to change was much, much more helpful to them. And also recognizing the huge motivator for recovery that children can be. I can tell you that my daughter is the reason that I sought treatment and the reason that I'm still here. And marginalized voices matter. I loved the presentations that had to do with narrative. And marginalized narrative. Many women with BPD are doubly disenfranchised, both by the abuse that they've suffered and by the negative attitudes of clinicians. I'll give you a personal example. In an inpatient hospitalization, I was sexually assaulted and brought legal action against the hospital. And their defense attorney sent my attorney a letter saying, you know that the only reason this client is bringing this suit is because she has borderline personality disorder. As if no sane person would care that they were sexually assaulted in a place where they gave up their own freedoms in order to ensure safety. So yeah, disenfranchisement and marginalization is huge with borderline personality disorder. And it's also important to provide ample information for parents who with mental illness. I'm noticing that there's a fair amount of it out there. NAMI is doing some great work with, particularly with parents of adult children with mental illness, but we really need to hear the voices of parents with mental illness as well and provide them with targeted information. I love that this conference provided parent scholarships and included parent voices, and that's a good place to start. Very, very important. Be trauma informed, particularly in populations with a high incidence of trauma in their personal lives and in their childhoods. Psychiatric systems can also be very, very re-traumatizing. So it's important. I love this this quote. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. And I just think how much more positive and supportive our personal and clinical interactions could be if we kept this in mind every time we encountered someone with BPD. Thank you very much. This is my introduction here to and for those of you that are local, I'm actually reading at Book Passage in Marin tomorrow night.
Any questions? I have just a comment, which is Karen Van Dosen discovered because she's doing training at a hospital inpatient program in Mountain View that includes mothers and babies together.
Oh,
so there at least is one.
I love this. I'm finding out about it. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Oh, yes.
There's I'm a practitioner and I've had a number of borderline personality clients, and in Australia we do have quite a few different courses and programs that people can go to get DBT, which is great. But there's also an app, an Apple app, that is incredibly useful, and it's DBT Self-Help. Unfortunately, it costs about $10, but it is one of the most extensive apps that I've found. What is it? It's called DBT Self-Help. DBT Self-Help. Yeah, and it provides extensive information on all the various different things that a DBT program would actually include. So it's a really useful.
Oh wow, I'll have to check this out. Do you know if it was put together by a clinician or if it was like a grassroots peer?
I don't know.
There's a website called dbtselfhelp.com that's
it's put together by cognitive psychotherapy and something or other. I haven't downloaded it on my iPod, on my iPhone, because the program's too big. It works really good on an iPad.
Oh, okay.
But it's almost like a training program, especially for any therapists as well that don't know much about it. It's a really useful tool.
Thank you. I will definitely check that out.
Oh, are you me? Yeah. Sorry. So the reason I came to this is I have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder as one of my diagnoses. I have a 19-month-old son, and the stigma that you're talking about, I still had a therapist who dropped me and wrote a letter to me, and the letter said, "With your many personality disorders, I pray God has mercy on you." And I had a therapist drop me because I got pregnant, and she felt that I should not have kids, and she said I was not compliant in her request for me to not have children. After my son was born, along with having bipolar and all these other things, and I had chosen to lower my meds to protect my son, I did go into psychosis and I was struggling, but I voluntarily went into psychiatric inpatient care. They called DHS, and I had absolutely no history of child abuse, and in fact have worked with children and families in my professional life, my whole life. They called DHS, and my child moved. My husband even was visiting and advocating for them. Can she see her son? They denied me access to my son. They denied me my right to breastfeed when I was on the unit, so I lost all of my breast milk. And the treatment I have watched with that diagnosis, the treatment that I get, and that professionals especially have a preconceived view of me, and they utilize it against me, and they do not look at all the parts of who I am. And then it's not just that, but you have stigma out in the real world, because I go to try to make friends, and somebody who does not have mental illness, I thought I could trust, and I confided, and I told her, and she actually told me, "Oh, I looked up borderline personality disorder on the internet," and then I got a text from this person that said, "I really don't have time for more friends." So even making friends while you have this, and I've been told my whole life by professionals, or the time that I've gotten care, keep it secret. Just don't tell anybody that you have these things. And then two, if you're a person who's sick like this and you get these diagnoses, look up the definition of personality, look up the definition of disorder, put them together, and then say to yourself, my God, what if somebody said this to you? How would it affect your self-esteem and who you are? And regarding my child, yep, I get really irritated when I go into a psychiatrist and the first question they have is, have you had any thoughts of hurting your son over the past month? And I sit there and I go, I love my son, I wanted him, so those things are pretty horrific. And when I was in inpatient care, I got told by a social worker If you ever come back here, I guarantee your child will be taken away for good. And I was threatened to the point that I was so afraid to speak that I just stopped speaking to any specialists, and my husband was telling them she's afraid of losing her kid. And I have family members too who don't understand it, so I was really grateful that you offered this up. And I know DBT, but one of the barriers I have with DBT is I do struggle with DBT myself right now. Despite the goodness of it, I think part of the fact that I have a college degree, there's a level that sometimes I feel DBT talks down to me, even though I also struggle at the same time, so I realize that. But one of the things about DBT is I had a psychiatrist who said to me, who said to me, I will not serve you unless you go do DBT specifically with a therapist. I will drop you. And so my husband and I felt threatened that we had to find a DBT therapist just to keep our psychiatrist, to keep my medications.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
And I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I saw where you're from, so she's where we live in the same area,
wow, that's awesome.
And we don't know that we're here.
We should totally talk at lunch, but yeah, no, that just breaks my heart. I have some similar stories also in Portland. I had a psychiatrist tell me in pregnancy that they would not work with me because I was too high risk.
Yeah,
I don't know how someone who's high risk would need more help, but the stigma is really, really awful. I was talking to someone today, in no other psychiatric illness would it be acceptable to call someone a bipolar, and yet people are called borderlines.
I got told when I said something, I'm sorry to interrupt, when I said something to my psychiatrist, I was so offended because she said to me, that's just your borderline talking.
Oh.
And I have carried that forward and said, an illness doesn't talk. A person talks with real thoughts and real opinions, and that was a psychiatrist that told me that.
Yeah. Wow. And the internet, you mentioned, that's the worst thing somebody can do, is just do a Google search on BPD, because, oh my God. There's so much pejorative, judgmental information out there.
And I got told by a clinical psychologist, you're married, I've been married for 13 years, and I got told by a clinical psychologist, that's just amazing, because people that have your disorders, the marriages don't usually last. And I was really hurt by that as well.
Oh yeah. No, I hear you. I've had a stable personal life. I've been with the same person for 10 years. And sometimes I feel personally like, the reason that I don't have to fight those battles about child protective services is that I have a partner who doesn't have mental illness, and I have private health insurance, so there's not the exposure bias of being in the public system. But yeah, as a diagnosis, frequently one of the issues that comes up is that if someone has a self-harm history, they're immediately tagged as having borderline personality disorder. Self-harm is only one of the 9 criteria for borderline personality disorder, and yet the two are conflated by clinicians a lot. I've spent 5 minutes in an ER with a treating psychiatrist where I basically just said, I'm having self-harm urges, I need to be admitted, and then they write down borderline personality disorder, they hear self-harm, and then they shut down. I was given the diagnosis at one of the most highly ranked psych hospitals in the country, based on a period of time in my life of only a few months in which I was actually having a manic episode, and was, every other aspect of my life, the previous 25 years was ignored, and I got, and I was upset when I got that diagnosis, and they said, it's just a diagnosis, it's just a term. And I said, yeah, a term, you're putting on me saying that at 26 years old I'm fundamentally flawed and broken. And then when I had the court case with the hospital, which to their credit has done a complete 180 in how they treat patients and their policies, and they've actually reduced their assaults, patient assaults by 60% because of the changes that were made because I reported them to the authorities. In that court case, my diagnosis was 10 years old, and they brought it up. So it sticks with you. And the tide is changing. There's a lot more neurobiological research out there, and I think clinicians are starting to listen to that and realize that a lot of times BPD has its roots in early childhood trauma. It may not necessarily be abuse, but it may be trauma. And so I think there has been some improvement. DBT has been helpful to a lot of people. It just, I validate you in that it does not necessarily work for everyone, which is why some of these other options are out there, and I think it's really great that there are alternatives. And some of those options can be used once you have the foundational skills of DBT in order to stay grounded and mindful and not be triggered. You can sometimes then move on to those more psychodynamic approaches, which is what I did. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to hear more voices and communicate that recovery and healing is possible. Somebody else have? Did somebody else have a comment or question? I'm really nearsighted, so I'm trying to figure out. Okay. Thank you.